I always say tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary, because tariffs are going to make us rich as hell. It's going to bring our country's businesses back that left us.
China just pulled off one of the most strategic moves in modern trade history. When the U.S. slapped massive tariffs on Chinese imports, Beijing didn't just sit back and take the hit. It found a clever workaround. By using Mexico as a backdoor into the American market, China is bypassing billions in tariffs while strengthening its global influence. But how exactly is this happening? And what does it mean for the U.S. economy? The answer might surprise you.
A new round of executive orders signed by President Trump today, this time for tariffs on goods from Canada, Mexico, and China. Americans are bracing for prices to rise at grocery stores and gas pumps across the country. And the move is stoking fears of a trade war as leaders in Canada and Mexico are vowing to hit back. Here's ABC's senior White House correspondent, Selena Wang.
When Donald Trump took office and imposed tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, the global economy felt the shock almost instantly. Businesses, governments, and everyday consumers were left scrambling to understand the potential fallout. Trump didn't ease into it either. He slapped a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico and a 10% tariff on goods from China. The reaction was immediate. These countries didn't just sit back and accept it. They pushed back hard with countermeasures and fierce objections. Economists and trade experts questioned how the U.S. planned to handle the inevitable consequences.
This time, if tariffs are long-lasting and broad-based, there won't be a bounce back. We may eventually regain our current rate of growth, but the level of output will be permanently lower. It's more than a shock. It's a structural change. The first thing we would see is a marked decline in exports. As Canadian goods become more expensive, U.S. demand for those goods would decline.
For a brief moment, Canada and Mexico caught a break. Trump delayed their tariffs. But China wasn't so lucky. In some cases, Chinese goods faced tariffs as high as 60%. Further straining the already tense relationship between the two economic giants. Beijing didn't take it lightly. They condemned the move, called it unfair, and even threatened legal action on the international stage.
The economic consequences of a protracted trade conflict would be severe, but it would be very different, a very different shock than the COVID-19 shock. In the pandemic, we had a steep recession followed by a rapid recovery as the economy reopened. This time, if tariffs are long-lasting and broad-based,
instead of playing defense, China got creative. If direct exports to the U.S. were becoming too expensive, they needed another way in. The answer? Mexico. With strong trade agreements already in place, Mexico provided the perfect gateway for Chinese goods to reach the American market. Chinese manufacturers saw an opportunity and wasted no time in taking advantage of it.
a lower Canadian dollar would provide a partial offset. In our model, with the scenario based on the February 1 executive order, exports fall by about 8.5% in the year after tariffs take effect. That's the green line. Canadian exporters respond by cutting production and laying off workers.
Trump's tariffs were meant to address trade imbalances and protect American industries, but businesses found workarounds. Rather than absorbing the extra costs, many corporations started shifting their production from China to Mexico. The big question quickly became, can anyone actually win a trade war? And what ripple effects would this have on the global economy?
Now, details of what could be the first action of President-elect Trump have just emerged from Washington, because Donald Trump has said he would impose a 25% tariff on goods coming into the US from Canada and Mexico, and an additional 10% on all Chinese imports, all on the first day of his presidency. Well, let's head to Washington to our North America correspondent Rowan Bridge, who is there. And Rowan, he talked about this a lot on the campaign trail, but he is...
For China, Mexico became a loop loophole, a way to sidestep costly U.S. tariffs. But how exactly did this strategy work, and what did it mean for American businesses and workers? To understand this, we need to look at how China leveraged Mexico's trade advantages and how this move reshaped global commerce.
U.S. President Donald Trump is delaying tariffs on imports from Mexico for a month. Its President Claudia Sheinbaum says. She spoke to Trump on the phone earlier today and told reporters she had gained the concession in return for increased efforts to combat cross-border drug trafficking. President Trump has posted on Truth Social about his phone call with the Mexican leader, saying it was a very friendly conversation wherein she agreed to immediately supply 10,000 Mexican soldiers on the border separating Mexico and the U.S.
Even before Trump's tariffs, Mexico had been gaining ground in the North American economy. By 2023, Mexico officially overtook China as the top exporter of goods to the U.S., sending an astonishing $475 billion worth of products, $20 billion more than the previous year. Rising tensions between Washington and Beijing, coupled with efforts to bring manufacturing closer to home, played a role in this shift. But there was another factor at play that didn't get much attention at first. Chinese companies had discovered a new way to keep their products flowing into the U.S.
As you see on the screen, the White House press briefing, and the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, just announced that President Trump is indeed planning to enact tariffs tomorrow. Here's what she said.
I was just with the president in the Oval Office, and I can confirm that tomorrow, the February 1st deadline that President Trump put into place at a statement several weeks ago continues. The president will be implementing tomorrow a 25% tariffs on Mexico, 25% tariffs on Canada, and a 10% tariff on China.
Take the Alianza Industrial Park, located about 250 kilometers from the U.S.-Mexico border. Originally built to support Mexico's growing auto industry, it quickly became a hotspot for Chinese businesses looking to bypass tariffs. Instead of exporting directly from China, they set up shop in Mexico, where they could benefit from trade agreements with the U.S. In just a few years, the number of Chinese manufacturers in Mexico's industrial zones doubled. Some of the biggest Chinese firms specializing in high-end car parts poured over $1 billion into new state-of-the-art facilities. The transformation was impossible to ignore. Once quiet industrial zones were now buzzing with activity. Heavy machinery worked around the clock, new factories popped up overnight, and supply trucks moved in a constant stream, transporting raw materials and finished products. Signs in Mandarin and English welcomed Chinese investors, making it clear that they weren't just dipping their toes in. This was a full-scale expansion.
Yes, very much so. I mean, as you say, Donald Trump did talk about this on the campaign trail, but it's always somewhat difficult to tell whether what he says on the campaign will translate into action. But in his post to his Truth social media site last night, as you say, he said he was going to impose 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico and an additional 10% tariffs on China. There are already some tariffs in place on some Chinese goods.
Mexico's automotive sector, already home to major manufacturers like Daimler Truck and Stellantis, kept running as usual. American and European suppliers continued producing essential components like glass windows and wiring harnesses. But now, Chinese firms were integrating into the same ecosystem, embedding themselves in an industry long dominated by Western players.
We further agreed to immediately pause the anticipated tariffs for a one-month period, during which we'll have negotiations headed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent, and Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick. And President Trump said, "I look forward to participating in those negotiations with President Sheinbaum as we attempt to achieve a deal."
This wasn't just a convenient shift, it was a strategic one. By setting up production in Mexico, Chinese companies gained access to the benefits of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. Under this deal, goods made in Mexico could be exported to the U.S. with significantly lower tariffs than those shipped directly from China. In other words, China found a legal and highly effective way to get around Trump's trade restrictions
between our two countries. Well, Mr. Trump had said a 25% import tax on goods from Mexico would begin on Tuesday, along with tariffs on goods from Canada and China. U.S. stock markets are down after opening for the first day of trading since President Trump confirmed those tariffs. He's also said that he'll definitely impose taxes on goods imported to the U.S. from the EU. Well, in a moment, we'll get reaction to the tariffs from Mexico with our correspondent Will Grant. But first, let's go to Washington and our correspondent there, Merlin Thomas. And Merlin,
it didn't take long for Washington to take notice. U.S. policymakers sounded the alarm, concerned that China was using Mexico to maintain its stronghold in the American market. Connor Biffer, a director at the national security think tank FDD Action, pointed out that Mexico's proximity to the U.S. gave Chinese companies a unique advantage. Other countries like Vietnam were also seeing increased Chinese investment. But Mexico's central role in North American trade made it a game changer. Political leaders weren't quiet about it either. Trump's former Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau both raised concerns. They worried that China's growing influence in Mexico could undermine U.S. trade policies. With the USMCA set for review in 2026, the big question wasn't whether China would keep expanding its presence in Mexico. It was how the U.S. and Canada would respond.
Worth understanding what a tariff is. Effectively, it's an additional fee onto any imports into the country, which means that any goods coming in from Canada effectively are going to cost 25% more. Now, some of that may be absorbed by the importer, but some of it might be passed on to the consumer. And the fear here is that ultimately what that means is higher prices for consumers in the shops.
It's interesting because when you read the detail of this, you would assume it's to do with trade or protectionism.
Official figures from Mexico estimated that Chinese and Hong Kong investments totaled around $450 million last year, just 2% of total foreign investment. But independent research suggested otherwise. Market analytics firm Silo found that Chinese companies had doubled their industrial space in Mexico in just 3 years. While they made up only 3% of total leased space, they had absorbed 7% of new capacity since 2020, making them the third largest players in Mexico's industrial market, behind only the U.S. and Mexico itself. For Mexico's newly elected president, Claudia Sheinbaum, the rising presence of Chinese businesses presented both opportunities and challenges. As China continued solidifying its role in Mexico's industrial sector, the ongoing trade conflict between global superpowers only escalated. The economic entanglement was growing too complex to ignore.
The point Gary was making, I think, is something we ought to bear in mind. There are specific reasons, and it's in American law as well, that the president has the authority to use tariffs if countries are doing things like dumping in the United States or doing things that adversely affect American security. But the president-elect has been making the point that he is talking about blanket tariffs, 10 to 20% on all countries and maybe even 60% on China. That's a very different animal.
Juan Carlos Baker, a former trade official, made it clear this situation wasn't going away. Something major was happening in northern Mexico, and it had Washington's full attention. At the heart of it all was a major player in China's automotive industry, ZC Rubber. ZC Rubber, China's largest tire manufacturer, was making massive investments in Mexico's Alianza Industrial Park. Nearly half of the billion-dollar investment flowing into the park from Chinese firms came from ZC Rubber alone. Their groundbreaking ceremony in Coahuila last August was a big deal. Mexican officials welcomed them with traditional gifts, including a finely woven tapestry and a statue of the nation's coat of arms, an eagle perched on a cactus, clutching a serpent.
Because that would have an effect on a whole range of American companies, companies that use Chinese parts, companies that source in China to make cars or various other things. And also, if you go into your neighborhood Walmart or Target, it's going to raise the price of all the goods that they import from China and sell to you as a consumer. So for specific purposes, yes. For broad purposes, it's going to be much more damaging to the economy and to the average American.
Just a month later, another Chinese corporation set up shop in the region, celebrated with a grand ceremony featuring red ribbon cutting and vibrant traditional Mexican dances. These events weren't just for show. They signaled Mexico's eagerness to attract more Chinese businesses. The governor of Coahuila, Manolo Jimenez, even traveled to the Beijing Auto Show to personally invite more Chinese companies to invest. The effort paid off. Coahuila is now the second largest recipient of Chinese investment in Mexico based on 2023 statistics. But analysts believe China's true investment in Mexico is far greater than official numbers indicate. Consulting groups like the Rhodium Group estimate that the real figures could be up to 6 times higher than reported. This is because foreign direct investment, FDI data, often misses key transactions, obscuring the full scale of Chinese influence.
You know, these countries have an opportunity to get on board with the President of the United States and to partner with us to deal with illegal immigration, to take back their individuals that have been in our country illegally. We want to repatriate them home, and they can be partners. So economically, yes, they will feel pain. They will feel what this consequences are.
Mexico's growing economic ties with China haven't gone unnoticed. Just last month, armed Mexican Marines stormed Mexico Mart, a shopping center in downtown Mexico City known for selling low-cost Chinese imports. Many saw this as a calculated move to assure the U.S. that Mexico was serious about addressing concerns over Chinese trade practices. But whether that's enough to change the trajectory of China's influence in Mexico remains to be seen. Despite these warnings, trade patterns suggest that Chinese imports into Mexico are only increasing. At Manzanillo, Mexico's largest port, more than 40% of all incoming shipping containers originate from China. Data from freight analysis firms indicate that in just the first 9 months of 2024, container shipments from China to Mexico have surged by 19%.
And we'll be able to continue to go forward with a president who's strong, who's putting America first.
You know, let me just stress that point that I made, which is the president cites stopping the flow of fentanyl and undocumented migrants for reasons for these tariffs. And yet, Madam Secretary, Canada is not a major source of fentanyl coming into the United States. It's frankly minuscule compared to what is seized at the southern border.
Meanwhile, business leaders like Francisco Gonzalez, who represents key auto industry suppliers, contend that fears of a Chinese takeover of Mexico are exaggerated. Yes, Chinese corporations are expanding their footprint, but they are far from achieving market dominance. Luis Rosendo Gutierrez, Mexico's Undersecretary of International Trade, shares a similar sentiment. He dismisses the notion that China is exploiting Mexico as a workaround to bypass U.S. tariffs, arguing that Chinese investment levels remain relatively low compared to overall trade flows. He also points out that both the U.S. and Canada continue to import substantial quantities of goods directly from China.
President Trump signed sweeping tariffs on goods imported from Mexico, Canada, and China, some as high as 25%. And they're likely to have a major impact on what you pay. We have 2 reports tonight, beginning with Yamiche Alcindor, who is with the president. Yamiche, good evening. These are wide-ranging tariffs.
That's right, Jose. The president signed an order to implement 25% tariffs on Mexico and a 10% tariff on China.
While at first glance, tariffs may appear to be nothing more than simple taxes imposed on imported goods, their impact extends far beyond that. These economic measures have the potential to disrupt entire industries, altering trade relationships and shaking up global supply chains in ways that are difficult to predict. The question of who ultimately bears the financial burden of these tariffs is not as straightforward as it seems. It largely depends on how businesses adapt and how governments respond. Right now, all eyes are on Mexico, which is feeling the pressure in a big way. One of the biggest shifts in trade between Mexico and the United States has happened in the automotive industry. Today, cars and auto parts make up more than a third of Mexico's growing exports to the U.S. But with new tariffs looming, Mexico faces a tough choice. How can it keep its trade balance intact? Some argue it should reduce its reliance on China, but that's easier said than done. Across North America, leaders are looking for ways to protect their industries. And China's growing role in Mexico is becoming a major point of contention. However, completely cutting off Chinese involvement isn't just unrealistic, it's nearly impossible.
25% tariff on Canada, except for energy products, which have a lower tariff, 10%. The White House says that's to keep costs down for things like oil and gas. This all takes effect on Tuesday. The White House says that this is to help with border security and to stop fentanyl from coming into our country. Now, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canada will be pushing back forcefully, but Trump officials say that if any country tries to retaliate, the tariffs could be increased. Jose?
The automotive sector is a perfect example. Chinese companies have been steadily expanding in Mexico, though many are not directly manufacturing there yet. According to Mexico's National Association of the Auto Parts Industry, around 1,000 Chinese firms operate in this space, but only 36 of them have production facilities in Mexico. Still, that hasn't stopped their exports from surging. In just 2 years, Chinese firms based in Mexico have increased their exports to the U.S. by a staggering 50%. Francisco Gonzalez, the head of the association, insists this isn't part of an aggressive takeover by China. Instead, many automakers have actively invited these companies because they rely on specific components that Chinese manufacturers produce. The reality is that many American automotive jobs depend on parts made by Chinese firms operating in Mexico. This level of interdependence makes the idea of completely severing ties with China highly impractical, not just for the US, but also for Canada, Germany, and other major economies that rely on Chinese-made auto components.
Not a negotiating tool?
No, it's not. No, it's a pure economic. We have big deficits with, as you know, with all three of them. And in one case, they're sending massive amounts of fentanyl, killing hundreds of thousands of people a year with the fentanyl. And in the other two cases, they're making it possible for this poison to get in, number one. And number two, we have big deficits, and it's something we're doing, and we'll possibly very substantially increase it. We're not. We'll see how it is. But
take General Motors, for instance. It is one of the biggest importers of Chinese auto parts into Mexico, and 1 in 5 cars sold in Mexico today comes from China. Among them is GM's Chevrolet Aveo, a top-selling model. But what's raising even more concern in Washington is the growing potential for Chinese-made electric vehicles to enter the U.S. market through Mexico. So far, no major Chinese automaker has announced plans to build factories in Mexico. But industry insiders say companies are actively scouting locations. This trend has caught the attention of Donald Trump, who has repeatedly brought it up during his campaign. But this issue extends beyond the auto industry. The U.S. sees China's expanding presence in Mexico as a broader strategic challenge. Companies like Huawei are also making inroads, adding to concerns about cybersecurity and data privacy. China's growing presence in Mexico is more than just a trade loophole. It's a power move with global consequences. As the U.S. scrambles to respond, one thing is clear. The economic battle between these superpowers is far from over. Will Washington find a way to close this back door, or is China's strategy too deeply embedded to stop? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.